Welcome to the City Report Card with Bob Bernstein and Ashley Northington. The City Report Card is a Zoomcast where we explore Nashville through a different perspective, aside from it being Music City, It City, or any other kind of city, except for the one we've lived in for a long time and seen change dramatically, and not always for the people or for the better. We decided to do this show after serving 3 years on the Chamber's Education Report Committee, where we learned a lot about how the public school district works, how it's funded, and what challenges it faces. After all of the interviews, readings, and discussions, our biggest takeaway is that we cannot judge the public school district without first judging ourselves. That means we can't point fingers at public schools without taking a deeper look at all of the other systems and institutions that connect to it. And that's everything from affordable housing to private industry to transit and mobility to the nonprofit sector. This is why we're hosting this series of conversations to explore the connections and relationships in hopes that we can make a difference. So, who are we? Well, I'm Ashley Northington, and I'm what Nashvillians call a unicorn, meaning I'm actually from here. In fact, I'm a fourth generation Nashville native, and my passion for education stems from the amazing experiences I had having attended 8 Metro Nashville public schools. Yes, I said 8. I'm a graduate of Antioch High School, a former education reporter, state education department official, education policy analyst, and now I work with educational institutions across the country, helping them navigate challenges and better connect with their audiences. I do this work because I know the tremendous value education has had in my life, and I want to make sure that more students have a great experience too. Bob?
Yeah, thanks, Ashley. And I'm Bob Bernstein. I too was a newspaper reporter, moving here from suburban Chicago 32 years ago to write mostly about government and state tax reform. After a couple of years, I realized I liked Nashville more than journalism, and then pivoted to become a restaurant entrepreneur, opening several places, including Bongo Java and Fido. I've had a long time interest in politics and education, working on many campaigns starting when I was 10 years old. And I began reading education reform publications in college when I realized that how formal education had failed me. And over time, I've pursued these interests to get involved in Nashville. I was a founding board member of Hands on Nashville and Nashville Prep, and I was a board member of Nashville's Farmers Market and Avintra Montessori School. My wife Irma and I have a son at Avintra and another who just started at Human Fog High School. And today we're excited to be joined by Chamber of Commerce President and CEO, Ralph Schulz. Ralph took the helm of the Chamber in 2006 after a 30-year career in nonprofit management, marketing, and fundraising. After 20 years with Junior Achievement, he returned to Nashville to lead the National Federation of Independent Business, and later he became the CEO of the Adventure Science Center. He has won numerous leadership awards, serves on many community boards and committees, and was the head of the Chamber when it was named Chamber of the Year by the American Chamber of Commerce Executives. And perhaps the highlight of that illustrious resume will soon be that he was the inaugural guest on the City Report Card Zoomcast. So welcome. How are you doing, Mr. Schulz?
So proud to be the inaugural guest, especially with two of the great education activists of Metro Nashville. Seriously. One thing, Bob, about the resume, whether as a volunteer or as a part of my job, one central thread in almost everything I've done throughout my whole career is work in education and work on education. That kind of was a seed planted by my dad, who both insisted on my performance in schools, as well as himself being an activist on education, really from the 50s on. So I remember a lot of his work in that area.
Mm.
And that leads right into your question, I think, Ashley. Is that right?
It does. So, Ralph, what I want to kind of learn from you is, based on your experiences with the Chamber, what role do you think the Chamber has played in education historically? How do you think it's evolved over time? And how maybe do you see it changing in the near future?
Well, my direct knowledge of the history goes back to about the mid 1990s, when as then a member of the chamber, I was aware of the fact that the chamber had designated education to be their number one priority. Primary focus at that point in time was really metro schools, K-12. Even at that point, it was really, 112. Okay, at that point in time, and progressively, as kindergarten became more important, and as even pre-K has become more important, that whole range has been covered. Prior to that time, there was activism in the chamber around education, but it really became emphasized in that mid-90s timeframe when you started to see the chamber beginning to develop programmatic interest in the schools. What kinds of education ought to take place in the schools, and what kinds of education can the business community support? There was also a time that they became interested in the policy of the schools, both at the state level and at the local level. And so they became much more engaged with school board. They became engaged with school board elections in hopes that they could help people with the expertise and the leadership capability to get into place to do the things necessary to improve the performance of the schools. I would say if there's a central thread in my personal experience with the chamber on this, it is the fact that the chamber, business people really focus on students. They really focus on student performance. And it's not really just the whole aggregated group of students. It is, they really do take to heart what's each individual student's experience and what are they prepared for after they finish that public school experience in pre-K-12. MNPS has been mostly the focus. Now, over the last 5 years, that focus has expanded. It is expanded to post-secondary, community college, TCATs, four-year institutions, with the belief, as we have continued to see unemployment drop, the need for everyone to be equipped to take that next step in their life, whether it is out of a formal education system to get a certification or whatever, or even an apprenticeship, or a formal process through a TCAT or through a community college or college, that they're maximizing their opportunity there. So the last thing I think I would say is that education's been seen as the foundational aspect of someone's economic success later in life. The next chapter is much about those things, particularly for adults, that make achieving that skill development and that education more difficult. Housing is an issue. Transportation is an issue. Childcare is an issue. Mayor Briley, the establishment, now I can't remember the name right off the top of my head, that provides the augmentational support to people who want to go to community college, that helps them with their transportation needs, their book needs, and so forth. Those programs are going to be necessary if people are going to avail themselves of a good education.
Is it fair, I'm going a little bit off script here from what Ashley and I talked about, but is it fair to say that the Chamber's work with education has kind of morphed over the years, starting with they decided that needed good public education to help recruit business and to improve the economy around here. But it seemed at first, reading some of the old education reports, that it was more of a judgment of the schools and was more of a hammer. And lately, it seems, at least our work on the committee has been more around how do we advocate for the schools and how do we get involved in the schools? Is that a fair assessment, or?
I think it's a fair assessment of maybe the early 90s and the late 90s, partially because there was just the information available and the data available on schools was really limited. I mean, the educational report was really kind of formed to amass information that people felt the public would need to know. And the reason the chamber felt they needed to know that is that once they had the information, the belief was that the community would rouse itself to drive the kind of support and innovation in the schools that would improve performance. I think as time went on, you know, the academies of Nashville are a good example where business felt, all right, it's not enough to be providing information. It's not enough to be engaged in policy discussions. What investment are we going to make in the actual execution in the classroom? What actual support are we going to provide? So the academies, which was really started by 8 principals in the metro school system with little support from the central office at the time, those principals caught the chamber's attention, and the business community rallied around them and said, we think small learning communities are a great idea. We think academies are a great idea. We're going to engage. And so with their funding and with their volunteer time, they began to help develop a model which has now become an international model. I mean, literally, people travel from around the world to see how these academies function. So the short answer to your question is, I think early on they thought if the community had information, they'd rally around the schools. And then it became clear that there needed to be more of an activist role by the chamber.
And I think that's part of the reason I think we called this the city report card, this Zoomcast, because I think that's the same thing we're trying to say is like if the city knew, if the public knew what was going on, they'd rally behind it. But even new members of our committee were shocked to hear that in public schools we spend half to a third of what is being charged at schools like MBA and Ensworth and this and that. And then coupled with that, the pride we have in Nashville, the objection we have anytime, the pride of a low tax community and the objections that come right away as soon as we decide we want to raise taxes. How do you balance those two things? It's like the city wants low taxes, not having an income tax is a good selling point to the city for economic development. But then things like transportation, education, affordable housing, how do you pay for them? So how do you balance that?
Well, I think this is my personal perspective, okay, that I'm offering here. Not a chamber position. I don't know that we've ever taken a vote on this. In order to have a prosperous community, there's a cost attached to having that prosperous community, and that cost is kind of a set cost. So you're either going to do the necessary work and spend the necessary money through taxes, or you're going to do it through philanthropy, or you're going to do it, or these businesses are going to do it investing in their own businesses to make up whatever gap may exist. And at different times you've seen that happen. You know, when businesses felt they didn't have access to workforce that had the necessary skill level, that's when you see training spending increasing. Or when they don't have access to workforce because of transportation issues, that's when you see public transit subsidies start to appear in businesses. So I think there's just always a constant debate about what share of the load's going to be covered by taxes by all of us. And by the way, what form does that tax take? You know, is it a sales tax? Is it a property tax or whatever? It's a complicated discussion to have across a whole community. So then you turn to philanthropy, and then you turn to business resources that are directly invested. And I think the one thing that most people agree on is that whatever issue you may have with the way education money is being spent at the moment, I think most people agree that it is an under-resourced category, and that there is going to be the need to increase those resources. I know among the business people I talk to, not only do they understand that, but they support it. They just want it to be well thought out with strong accountability for results attached to it.
Hmm. That's, that's a really interesting perspective. As a person that has, worked with school districts and in other places, I have seen that sort of carrot, like we give you more money if you have more accountability. That hasn't always worked well, and it hasn't always produced the best results because. From Bob's perspective, from our education report card committee's perspective, um, it takes all of us. And so there are other systems that are involved and help make education, our system, what it is. And so when we say that if we would give you more resources that are going to be tied to some academic performance, it still puts the onus on the district alone. And it doesn't necessarily account for these other factors, that, may affect a student's ability to perform.
And that's exactly, look, from a chamber perspective, our belief is that if we can improve the economic position of of a household, then that is going to have an attendant effect with the young people and the students. So when you see us engaged in increasing opportunity through job growth and those other kinds of things, you also see us putting an emphasis on workforce development and education. Now, I know those sound like pretty sterile words, but the cascading effect of that strategy, creating jobs, generating a workforce, education, and then, transportation, housing, childcare, and those other issues. One of the nonprofits I'm really glad to have seen formed can only operate on a limited scale, and that's a nonprofit called Uprise. And what they do is Uprise focuses on adults that have ambition and have capability to improve their level of skill so that they can access a higher paying job. They know that education is an important feature of getting to that point. So what they do, since many of those people are already working two jobs, is they provide a stipend to those people while they're getting that education to get into that higher level job. And they found in some cases they had to provide transportation. They had to provide the opportunity for childcare. It's very difficult for them to provide housing options. But when you get to that adult status and now you're out there trying to make your way, the whole situation gets a lot more complicated. And that's why the focus on pre-K 12 is so important. But improving the economic status of adults in the household is, I think, an important component. But Ashley, coming back to what you said, that the accountability focus needs to be on the leadership of the school system. I heard Randy Lowry one time say in one of his talks that no organization can exceed the capability of its leadership. And so it's important to hold the leadership accountable for those results. I think most people are sympathetic to the fact that teachers are asked to do a lot,
Yes.
and they do a lot. But I think people are also looking at the system and saying what needs to be done with the system so that those teachers have the opportunity to accomplish as much as they can accomplish with those students, with the outcome being the students well prepared.
Right. Bob and I came into this committee 3 years ago. And the first year we looked at social and emotional learning. And I really advocated for that to be the topic. And in fact, I was the deciding vote for that to be the topic, because in my view, not that we, all of the things that are wrapped up in social emotional learning are great. But in my view, the most important thing was the things that you just mentioned. Through social and emotional learning, we can address some of the other factors that are happening in a child's life. And I think that, workforce education, adult education, all of those things are super impactful to how a child shows up and ready to learn or not. And so we made a series of recommendations about some of that stuff, not necessarily all of it school related. The next year, we kind of had this sort of whole city approach where we're like, listen, it takes the whole city to be engaged and involved. And we made a set of recommendations, around that. And, this coming year in 2020, we'll make another set of recommendations. But what I have noticed is that we make these recommendations and we have this report and we're very excited and energized the day that the things come out, but then maybe sometimes it goes a little flat. From your perspective, what can the chamber do to sort of activate people and rally them around the recommendations so that they become implemented within the community and not just sitting in our report?
Well, first of all, I think the chamber is just one component of a coalition that needs to be created. I think part of the answer is promotional. When we go into the community and we survey the community, we find education is the number one topic in general as we survey and poll the community. But with regards to engagement with the school system, that number is low. Generally, you're going to see the people who have kids in school to be the most involved and people who don't have the kids in school to be less involved. And generally, the older people get, the less connected they are to the school. So, it's going to take a coalition of people to rally around these ideas. You mentioned social emotional learning. Ashley, I don't know, you and Bob may have been on the trip we took to Austin a couple of years ago with community leaders, and we looked at their school system, which is well outperforming the school system in Nashville with the same size budget and basically the same level of attendance. And one of the things that they said that made their schools more effective was their attention to social emotional learning, which they said it took them 20 years to install effectively in their system. It took a legislative mandate from the state legislature directed at the school systems in Texas. And then it took the school system to spend the money and to create the resources to have every teacher in a position of encouraging a student. I'll never forget what they said their goal was. They said their goal was that when a student walks through the door of any school in Austin, the goal is to have them say to themselves, I belong here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so social emotional learning is a big deal, but it takes an investment, and you got to have a sustained effort of support to install something that is so diverse in its application. I mean,
and it's hard. And you said before about accountability. Social emotional learning is one of those things that I agree with you. It's very important, but it's hard to measure, and it's hard to rally the public around that you're going to teach social emotional learning rather than arithmetic and language or whatever. So I'm going back to what you said about accountability. I agree there needs to be accountability. I'm not questioning that, but how do you grade a school district when you've got affordable housing problems, like you said, workforce poverty issues, transportation issues, and that? How can you really judge the school district when they have to deal with all these things? All these things are being put on their doorstep. Kids are moving around school to school all throughout the school year because they can't afford it because they're being priced out of their homes. So how do you hold anybody accountable unless you're going to hold, as we say, the whole city accountable?
Ashley, you look like you had an answer.
I don't have an answer. Well, I do have some answers about some of this, but no, I don't have an answer. I just relate because I would have been what you call a high mobility, highly transient student. Again, I went to 8 different schools, and I remember my kindergarten teacher, her name is Mrs. Armstrong at Kings Lane Elementary. She came to visit me at my house. And she made sure that I was okay. In the 4th grade, when I was at Dalewood Elementary School, I had a teacher named Mrs. Bunch, and every day she made me stand up. Well, she made the whole class, I was in the class, stand up and repeat this poem called I Am Special, I Am Unique, I Am the Only Me There Is. You have to do all this stuff. And those are the things that sort of made the difference. So despite maybe some of the circumstances or some of the other things that maybe went around me, I knew that I had the ability to do amazing things. And so I just don't see necessarily that happening all the time in our schools. Most of the time when we have a conversation, with other people outside, the folks who are really invested in education, and we talk about the investment that needs to be had, we frame the budget in terms of a revenue, an expense problem. Like, well, they get, $1 billion nearly, and what are they spending it on? We need to look at how they're spending the money, which is true, right? But my perspective is that perhaps there is a revenue issue and there's not enough money going into the system to support some of all of the things that Bob was talking about. So there's just a really fine line of, a small little hole in a needle to thread to make sure that we have all of those components together.
I think Bob's question about how do you measure that and how do you hold accountable, that's the toughest question to answer. I think, for many people, for most of us, it's some numbers somewhere that are attached to what causes a student to cross that finish line with the capabilities that they need to be able to survive in society after they have left school or continue on in getting that schooling. I think the answer to that question is something that we're still searching for. But I do think that Austin's a good example of a circumstance where some of those issues, those environmental issues that occur, are being dealt with. And what they demonstrate through their numbers is that social emotional learning has made that impact on their student learning and their student performance. And by the way, their teachers are frankly, much more satisfied with their environment as well. They find that the task of learning is easier when those social emotional learning needs are being taken care of. Mm-hmm. So there's no silver bullet. This is too significant and environmental to be solved with one silver bullet. It's going to kind of take improvement in all these things. But I would tell you from a chamber perspective, I think it's, we've had a lot of discussion around this thought of, if the household economic environment can be improved, then those environmental factors for the student are going to lead to the improvement in those environmental factors, going to lead to better performance in the school system. So that's why we are engaged in these other things now: housing, transportation, childcare as well. And the way that manifests itself at the chamber is that businesses are engaged in independent activity to support organizations or support policies that propose solutions to those things. But I think you can find, you're finding more and more businesses that are aware of the need to deal with those factors as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like to think of myself as the living example of that being true. What you said, as my parents got older and did better, I did better in school. My report cards prove that out. As our financial situation improved, everything else improved too. So I wholeheartedly agree that more people need opportunities to be put on a pathway to prosperity. It's all about the money.
When you find people who have ambition and unfulfilled capability, you got to support them to get that opportunity to realize the ambition and to fulfill that capability. And unfortunately, for too long, people have reached a point where they have to take care of themselves, and they haven't had that opportunity to reach their full capability.
Mhm, mhm.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big problem, is people are so busy taking care of today, they can't deal with next week or next year for their kids. I get it. So one more question. We called this the city report card. During the committee days, I kept talking about, how do you put together a report card of the city to measure how the city is doing? Factors like, what is our effective tax rate, which is really low, and what is our homeless issue, and how much affordable housing? What factors would you put in of a city report card to measure ourselves, to see how healthy we are for everybody?
Well, vital signs is sort of a
Mhm.
grassroots oriented, our vital signs report is sort of a grassroots and research attempt to develop that kind of a measure. So when you look at vital signs as compared to the education report, we don't call it a report card anymore, because it's not really a report card, it's a report. I think you guys have participated in changing that
Yeah,
perspective.
we were pretty vocal.
Yeah. Um, when you look at vital signs, you see things in there like housing, per capita income, health culture. You see a variety of features that rise to the top that we know from research, and we know from response from the community, are things that they view as important to maintaining a quality of life in this community that is desirable. I think the next thing you've got to do, and we're doing this with our Deep Prosperity Trust, is you have to pay special attention to broadening that engagement in that successful economy as much as possible. You've got to, you don't want, from an economic perspective, you don't want people excluded from the economic opportunity that the prosperity in the region is providing. And I'm telling you, even though we're in a COVID situation right now, we are rapidly moving back to where we were last February with our economic recovery. And it won't be long again before we're very much in the same position we were last February economically. And that makes it really important to broaden that economic participation so that people are both fulfilling their capability, but also benefiting from the economy as it grows. We still think education's the number one component of that, but we also see those other factors as important contributors to reaching that prosperity for everybody.
Mhm.
There's always going to be different levels of economic success in the community. There's always going to be, pick it, the Steve Jobs or the Bezos, okay? But everybody should have an opportunity to get to that level where they can feel that they're benefiting from that prosperity out there.
That
So
would be
how
nice.
how do we make sure that people are engaged? Like, what are the steps like that need to happen to ensure that that can be realized?
I used to think it's just about getting the information out there so people could see it, but there's got to be an emotional hook to it. They've got to understand what the value is to them and what the value is to the broader community. People need to know, need to grasp emotionally how this education success and this deep prosperity is of benefit to every single person here, including people that feel like they've got it made. That there's a benefit that every single person in this community can feel from that broad participation in prosperous growth. But not everyone recognizes that. So a message has to be developed. That's just my belief.
I agree. I think I moved here in 1988, and the chamber and others were debating whether we should keep or get rid of the moniker, the Music City. And, 30 something years later, it's kind of laughable that they were actually discussing that. But I think we've done a remarkable job, the city, to promoting that as a tourism destination, as a business hub and all that. But one thing we haven't been able to promote is for what's here for the residents, whether it be education or all these other issues we've talked about. There's no Butch Sheridan of education. Butch has done a remarkable job of promoting tourism, but there's nobody like him saying education is the thing we got to do and just being the cheerleader for the city. And I agree with you. I think that's needed. You're the marketing guy. So how do we do that?
Well, I mean, there's the mechanics and then there's the message, right?
Right.
And that message, look, people are moving here because this is better than where they are.
Mm-hmm.
And they're staying here because it's better than any place they can see anywhere else. I think what we've got to the message to people has got to be, if you like it this way, we need to stay at it. We need to keep working at it. Bob, I'm a history buff, and every time I take a job, I look backwards. And, when I look at Nashville of the 70s and 80s, you see a pretty stagnant and declining place.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't until the early 90s when both elected officials, Phil Bredesen in particular, and business officials, which was a very small but powerful group at that time, said, this is unacceptable, that they began to put plans in place, work together to develop and to execute those plans, to bring Nashville now 30 years later to a place where, the expansion of opportunity is real. The resilience of this community, as demonstrated in the flood, the recession, and now the virus, is real. If we want that to continue, then that increasing population has to take a part in seeing that it continues. So, it's not to sing the Nashville's praises again, but that's one of the reasons that we've started a new activity called Intro Nashville, and it is aimed at the people who are coming here to have them understand that in return for the benefit that they get for being here, there's an obligation to be a part of making it happen.
That's great. I mean, because the other thing that I think people come here think as well is low tax state, no income tax, and I'll move to Williamson County for the better schools. And it's really, that's the part that really gets to me. Is like, that's a problem. You're moving out there and you're ignoring what's going on in Nashville. And so I applaud those efforts you're talking about.
Well, I do have to say that the tax rate in Tennessee is down the list. The affordability is actually a higher on their criteria, but what's attracting them here now is the culture. And when you bring culture and opportunity, job opportunity together, then at different times, different things weigh heavier. But right now, it's the culture of Nashville, the lifestyle in Nashville, that is attracting a younger, educated population of in-migration. And it is making us much more successful in retaining people who have opportunity elsewhere and set it aside. And look, I know you all have, and Bob, I know in your businesses, you see this a lot. The creative population of Nashville really embraces that creative theme, that creative, what I call the snap, crackle, and pop of that creative ambiance. As an entrepreneur, you represent a much larger share of our GDP, technical economic term, than compared to other metro areas in the country. I mean, we're almost a quarter of our GDP comes from entrepreneurial activity. And in most places, it's only about 18%. So the culture of the city is what's drawing people. And again, part of that culture is the fact we're engaged in improving the city, and they need to understand when they come here that that's part of the deal. Now, I look at companies like UBS and Amazon and Alliance Bernstein and Smile Direct, all of whom have entered recently, and they have embraced from the start that they have a role in the investing in the community. Um, and and now we need to do that too with the people that are moving here. I'm
Yeah,
going
that's-
on and on. Have I
yes.
ended my time?
I think
We-
Ashley was giving me a signal there.
Yes, we definitely are at time. So the final word on how do we make education better is to make sure that the people and companies and other folks who are here have an active investment and realize that it takes all of us. That's how we'll wrap it up today. Thank you so much for joining us. Ralph, we appreciate your insights. I always love when I get to hear from you. I like hearing your perspective, even when it might differ slightly from mine. So thank you for taking the time to be our inaugural guest.
Well, I won't feel offended if you have to move me to like session 33 because
No, no, we wouldn't dare. You are number one.
All right. Well, it's
All right.
been a
Thank you
real
very
pleasure.
much. Really
And
enjoyed it.
thanks for what you guys do. Thanks for your investment, your engagement, your initiative, your role models.
I'll take it.
Right.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thanks, you guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye.